Howdy folks, welcome back. I apologize, I still need to get a better camera and actually set up a studio and start recording these at home so I'm not at school, but this will have to do for now. So today is the first of the slightly less scripted videos that I'm going to be doing for the next few weeks. I love to do the queer history stuff and I will continue working on that, but there's a lot of research involved. And as a result, it's going to take a little while. So bear with me on that. That's not to say that we're not going to be using research topics. It's just that this is a little less scripted and a little bit more built on my own knowledge, so that I'm basically backing myself up with sources as opposed to necessarily starting fresh. So that brings us to today's topic. We are going to be talking about Shakespeare through a queer lens. Now, I do want to just start off with the question that I get surprisingly often from my students when Shakespeare comes up, and that's simply the question of, was Shakespeare gay? The short answer is no. No, he wasn't. I don't know where this came from. I have come across it on the internet a couple times. I've had students bring it up. The first encounter I ever had with such an idea was actually, believe it or not, in an episode of Doctor Who, in David Tennant's run. And it was played for laughs. I have since come across it in other contexts, and I do know that there is a bit of a scholarly precedent where scholars have talked about this. But all evidence seems to point towards no. He was absolutely not gay in the sense that we would understand things today. Sorry, I'm adjusting the camera slightly. Okay. So yeah, I don't know where it came from. He wasn't. But it is useful to talk about what we do know about his relationships, and what we know about him as a person. And admittedly, there's not a whole lot. He was not somebody who enjoyed spending much time talking about himself. Most of what we did get was basically just from like notes and other things that he wrote, never really intended for public release, at least as far as we can tell, because they were published by his publisher after his death. That's not to say that he never wanted anyone to see them, but I don't think he was necessarily planning on it either. Also, we do know he was married to a woman, in case that needed to be stated. And all indication seems to be that he was happily married. In fact, his courtship with his wife was somewhat drawn out because at the time he was legally not able to pursue her without permission of her father. So he had to go through a number of hoops and hurdles and stuff like that just for the relationship to even start. Just because he was 18 at the time and she was 26. And, well, to put it simply, he needed her parents' permission to continue this whole thing. And he probably wouldn't have gone through that problem or that trouble if, you know, he was just looking for a sham marriage to cover up the fact he was gay. So there's not much proof there. It's also worth pointing out he did have 3 children by his wife. Unfortunately, his son did pass away at only 11 years old, and neither of his daughters ever had children who lived to adulthood. So his line kind of ended with his daughters. That's kind of just a historical side note. It doesn't have anything to do with him or his sexuality or anything like that, but it is worth noting. That's not to say he was entirely straight, though, either. There were rumors both in his lifetime and since then of him having dalliances with various men, both in and out of his social circle, so both actors and non-actors, basically. We also know from his poetry that he was probably, you know, showing some romantic interest in men, because in his sonnets, which are all about love and romance, He wrote 182 of the dang things. Most of them are ambiguous. It doesn't define a gender for either the speaker or the intended recipient. But of those 182, 10 were directed towards women, and 27 were directed towards men. So again, this is not cut and dry, but I think it's pretty safe to say that there was some attraction there. So the question then becomes, what do we call Shakespeare then? Well, first of all, we do have a term these days for people who are attracted to and engage in relationships with both genders, and that is bisexual. But can we really call him bisexual? I would say no. And the reason for that is that he lived during the early modern period, the Elizabethan era specifically, and he predates pretty much all of our modern concepts of gender and sexuality by at least 3 centuries. And honestly, at the time, he probably wouldn't have been concerned with labels too much. Men having intimate relationships, including physical relationships with other men, was not considered bizarre. Uncommon maybe, but not bizarre or problematic unless it detracted from straight relationships. So that complication of, yes, they didn't really accept like homosexual marriage or long-term committed relationships in that sense, but a man sleeping with another man wasn't really necessarily considered a problem. So I don't think he would see a need to label himself. He's just a person who loves his wife, but also occasionally likes to have sex with men. Like, yeah, in the modern context, that would make him bi, but even if we brought him to the modern day, I don't know if he would be comfortable with that label. So, I don't know. But that's not to say this is the beginning and end of Shakespeare through a queer lens, because that's just talking about the man himself. It's when we get into his plays that things really get queer, for lack of a better term. I will clarify things. None of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here is necessarily like intentional in the classical sense. Like, it's not like he set out to like, I'm going to make this character gay, or this character is clearly intended to be a trans allegory, because he, again, didn't think in those terms. But at least looking at it from a modern lens, as a queer person, there's a lot of things that I recognize in his works as fitting within a queer framework. Okay. Now, before we move on to the plays themselves, though, a quick disclaimer. When I am talking about trans issues, when I am talking about cross-dressing, when I'm talking about people dressing up and changing their gender presentation and things like that, I am not, and I repeat, not referring to the fact that, according to Elizabethan custom, all female characters in plays were depicted by men. That's not what I'm referring to. At the time, there was this practice, this belief that women should not be allowed to act. They were not actors. And thus, if there was a woman in the play, it was played by a man. That's not what I'm referring to. When I am referring to characters that are, dealing with gender issues and gender presentation, and we're talking about gender stuff and cross-dressing and all that kind of stuff, I am referring to within the context of the play itself. Okay? So the story, not the actor. Okay? Just want to be clear on that one. All right, so let's start with his most famous play. It's not the strongest queering of a lens here, but we're going to start with Romeo and Juliet. Okay? Romeo and Juliet is focused entirely around the relationship between Romeo and Juliet, hence the title, and I'm sure most of you knew that already. By definition, it's a straight relationship. But that's not to say that the whole play is straight exclusively, because it plays a lot with the idea of the masculine and the feminine, okay? Especially within the context of Romeo and his friends. Now, there was this kind of belief at the time that this was written, that men were, for lack of a better term, macho. They were hard, they were stoic, they were violent, they were aggressive, and so on and so forth. Whereas women were the opposite, placid, calm, gentle, so on and so forth. The idea at the time is that when a man falls in love with a woman, it softens his hard traits and weakens the negative traits while strengthening the positive. Now, relationship-wise and societally, that's considered a good thing. But we're still dealing with young men in this play. Romeo and his friends don't feel that it's a good idea to be leaving masculinity behind as they see it and becoming softer. And thus Romeo, when he falls in love with Juliet, his friends mock him for becoming more feminine. And by that, they just mean that he's not as aggressive, he's not as stoic, he's not as violent, and so on and so forth, while they're still doing all of that stuff themselves. It's really more of a maturity thing, really, than a gender and sexuality thing, I guess. But it's still a valid point because the play itself plays a lot with this idea of male identity and male sexuality. So much so that this play is absolutely rife with double entendre, phallic imagery, men making cracks about their parts, and showing off to each other in that way, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, male sexuality is very much in the spotlight in this one. And especially when you combine that with the relationship between Mercutio and Romeo, which is a very close and intimate relationship. I'm not implying that they're gay. I am not, and I don't believe that they are. However, when we're already playing around with male sexuality, it puts another layer on that connection between this close relationship between these men. As a side note, it's not actually part of the play at all, but I will say that having reread this recently, because I'm going to be teaching this in the spring, and looking at it through a queer lens, probably the biggest queer aspect to it has nothing to do with the play itself, so much as context and interpretation, because the whole story is about forbidden love. And most queer folks, especially those who are homosexual or bisexual or what have you, and basically feel same-sex attraction, they would relate in a lot of ways, I think, to this forbidden fruit kind of aspect to the romance. Just as the Montagues and the Capulets have been at war, they can't be trusted, and one of the first things Romeo and Juliet have to do is kind of figure out, like, are we actually both attracted to each other? Do we want to continue with this? Is this actually a thing that's happening? Is something that I think is very relatable from a queer perspective, because just because I'm attracted to a woman doesn't mean that she's necessarily going to be attracted to me. Now, in my personal life, I don't have much direct experience with that because I've been happily married for over a decade. But nonetheless, it's still kind of a complicated situation of, just because I'm into this person doesn't mean that person necessarily will be into me, and things like that. And so, like, this same kind of shaky start to the relationship is something that a lot of queer folks, I think, can relate to. All right, moving on, we've got Hamlet. Hamlet is a little less direct even than Romeo and Juliet is, but again, it's dealing with gender identity a little bit, indirectly. In fact, it's something where, at least as far as I was able to determine, nobody really talked about much before T.S. Eliot. So that's only within the last century or so that people have started talking about it. But T.S. Eliot referred to it as Hamlet's problem. And Hamlet's problem seems to be one of identity. There's, again, these expectations of how a man, especially an unmarried man, is supposed to be acting at this point in history. And Hamlet does not feel like he's living up to that. And as a result, he refers quite often and identifies himself with women quite frequently. He's having a crisis of masculinity. Is he actually a man? I'm not trying to imply that he's trans. Obviously, I'm still using he pronouns. However, there does seem to be this indication of what we would call in modern psychological queer context as a gender crisis of this is what I think masculinity is, and I don't fit that. So what am I? Am I still a man? Do I have to redefine what I think is masculine, or do I have to redefine my own identity? And that whole concept of gender crisis is a big part of trans non-binary stories. We're trying to figure out, where do I fit into this? I don't identify this way, and I don't fit these contexts that I believe I'm supposed to socially, and I identify instead this way, and what does that mean for me? And that's really what is kind of one of the central core chunks of Hamlet's characterization in this. So I'm not saying that he was a trans woman or that he was even non-binary, but this gender crisis is a big part of queer theory in the modern literary sense. Next up, we have A Midsummer's Night's Dream. First, let's just talk about the elephant, or maybe more accurately, the ass in the room. As was stated by Sky Gilbert, this is a story of a gaggle of working class, semi-adult bachelors in a filthy travesty. You could use that to describe just about any queer romance in media in the last 2 decades. You know, like, in a lot of cases, that kind of tends to be the narrative in modern, at least male, homosexual depictions. And Shakespeare was doing it some 400 years ago. The play itself is not necessarily queer in its own right, but it is definitely hedonistic, and it doesn't shy away from the implication of homoeroticism. And there does seem to be some indications that was intentional on Shakespeare's part. Unlike a lot of the other stuff I'm talking about, this seems to have been intentional, where he was actually commenting on homosexuality and how it's depicted in the field of drama. Because at the time, there were kind of rules that you didn't want to depict homosexual men as being in a good light. And this whole thing is kind of playing with the idea of like sexuality and hedonism and pleasure and all that kind of stuff, and how it doesn't necessarily care about what society expects. And it's questioning what is right with sexuality. Is this acceptable? Is this something that we should pursue, or something we should deny? And so on and so forth. All right, and the last of the plays that I'm going to go into in detail is also one that is very important to me personally, and that's The Twelfth Night. The Twelfth Night. Oh, Viola, how you had a big impact on me as a young woman. Viola, one of the central conceits of the play is that Viola is a woman who dresses as a man. So, again, to take a step out of this from a meta perspective, again, this is not me referring to the fact that she would have been originally depicted by a man, because women were not allowed to be actors. But there was a certain kind of meta narrative that he was kind of playing around with, that Shakespeare thought it was kind of funny that, like, oh, here's a man dressed as a woman who's dressing as a man. And it becomes a common thread. We're going to see it in some of the other ones that we go through real fast here in a little bit. But yeah, Viola dresses up as a man and begins calling themselves Cesario. And while Viola never abandons their identity as a woman, they also simultaneously seem comfortable and embrace the role as a man, as Cesario. Now, this is, again, more gender presentation than gender identity, because they're fictional characters and they were written some 4 centuries ago. So it's a little bit hard to pin down exactly how they feel on the inside. But at least from the surface level, it seems like Viola / Cesario is, well, for lack of a better term, to put it in modern terms, non-binary. Or at least that's how I've interpreted them as a character. They don't wish to abandon their feminine side. They are still a woman. But simultaneously, they are also a man. And they're comfortable being that way. I will stress, this is 100% my modern projection backwards onto Shakespeare's works. Shakespeare would not have thought in terms of this. In fact, these terms didn't even exist yet. So saying that Viola/Cesario is non-binary would be disingenuous. However, that is how I always interpreted it, even when I was in high school and college and was discovering this for the first time. It really had a lot of impact on me personally, seeing that. And yes, it's my interpretation, but still seeing it gave me hope before I came out and started my own transition. So also, as a special side note, we've also got the relationship with Orsino. Now, this isn't the only relationship. There is also a relationship with a woman, but that one is not kind of played as the primary actual, like, this actually is what ends up, that's who gets the girl, so to speak, at the end. It's rather Orsino. And Orsino is, Orsino, which is, I don't know, I've convinced myself that neither sound right. So anyway, he falls in love with them, Viola/Cesario, as Cesario. So falls in love with a man, basically. But then, once the outfit comes out and Viola is presenting as female again, there's no change in relationship. He doesn't care. To him, he just loves the person for who they are. Male, female, other, doesn't matter. And that is probably the most overtly queer relationship in Shakespeare, except for, well, we'll get to that in a second. So, real quick, some rapid fire ones that either I don't quite know enough about to go into detail, or there's not enough there to go into detail. But so some rapid fire examples, lesser examples from his plays. First of all, we've got As You Like It. Ganymede is actually Rosalind in disguise. So again, we've got a woman dressing up as a man. Ganymede is referred to as a man throughout the story, despite being assigned female at birth. There is less indication that there's a comfort necessarily here, so there's less of a non-binary narrative there. However, Ganymede, the male persona, goes through a courtship scene with another man. Now, it's played kind of for laughs because of the fact that this man is deeply in love with Rosalind and doesn't know Ganymede is Rosalind. So there's also that kind of comedy aspect in there, but at no point is it played off as strange that this man and this other man, presumably, are going through the motions of courtship. Next up, we've got The Merry Wives of Windsor. This is not one I personally am familiar with, but I came across in my sources. And the concept is apparently two men falling in love with another man. So it's a love triangle, or rather a love arrow, I guess, because it's not between the two. Yeah, anyway. So two different men fall in love with a man. And that man, it turns out, is, once again, a woman in masculine presenting outfits and things like that. At no point, though, is the male-male aspect of the relationships played negatively. Again, it's supposed to be kind of like a dramatic irony sort of thing where we know that he is actually a she, but they don't know that, and they fall in love anyway. I mentioned, though, that there is one probably more blatantly obvious queer relationship in Shakespeare, and that's Othello. Othello and Iago have a deep and powerful bond that in any other context, I believe would be coded as a marriage. They are not actually married, but they do discuss the fact that there is an unbreakable vow between them. So there is that definite relationship. And of course, because of the characters that are involved with Othello and Iago, it doesn't really go well, and neither are really great people in regards to their relationship, but it's still there. Also, it's not a central focus of the play. All right, next up we've got The Winter's Tale, which again is one that I don't know super duper well. I've read it, but it's been years and years and years. But Hermione and Paulina. Hermione is basically forced to flee to live in the woods because of accusations of infidelity with her husband, which only seems to be further backed up by the fact that when she gets there, she moves in with Paulina, who is described as serving and servicing her in every way she needs. Now, again, this is maybe too much projection, but that could easily be read as a sapphic relationship, and the reason she was being, adulterous was because she wasn't into men. Next up, we've got The Merchant of Venice. Portia is not indicated to really have much in terms of like physical sexual attraction to anyone, let alone her husband. I personally would interpret her as being an example of an ace character in Shakespeare's works. Again, that's probably projection, and there's definitely room for other interpretations, but she seems to be ace. And actually, there does seem to be some connection, or at least in some interpretations, between her and her servant Nerissa, which would imply that if she is ace, she might be homoromantic. Again, I can't back that one up with a lot of proof, but that's kind of how I've interpreted it over the years. We also have Much Ado About Nothing, where we have the character of Beatrice, who is played off as being a little bit promiscuous. And it is also stated that she has shared a bed with a woman for at least a year, for over a year. Does that mean she was actually doing more than just sleeping in that bed with that woman? I don't know. Again, it's interpretation. It could definitely be read that way, especially given the characterization of Beatrice, but it's a little bit more open to interpretation. We also have some examples from Shakespeare's historical plays. His history play, yeah, that's a tongue twister. But we've got two examples there where they're not expressly stated, but given the historical context and what we know about the characters, they can easily be read this way. In Antony and Cleopatra, Cleopatra's court is rumored, it's hard to prove, but is heavily implied in history and to a lesser extent in the play to have a number of sapphic relationships. Now, that's not necessarily referring to Cleopatra herself, but the people she surrounds herself with very well might have had same-sex relationships going on in the background of the play. And then also we've got Troilus and Cressida, which again is not a play that I personally am familiar with, but it does feature as characters Achilles and Patroclus, which are a pair of characters that historically and culturally has been long depicted as a couple. Not so much a factor in the play itself from what I've been able to see, but short of actually reading through it, I couldn't tell you for certain if there's any subtext of homosexuality there going on between them, but the characters themselves can easily be coded that way and interpreted that way because the historical context also paints them that way. All right, so that's my real fast run through of queer Shakespeare, or Shakespeare if you prefer. No, that's really bad. I'm sorry. Anyway, so hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, give me a like and a subscribe. Down in the description, I will be putting links to my sources as well as to my TikTok, where I cover a lot of the same stuff. But if you don't want to sit around and listen to me ramble for half an hour, you can sit and listen to me ramble for 3 minutes at a time instead, where I kind of cover a lot of the major points just in less detail. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you again next week. Next week we're going to be shifting tracks just a little bit, and we're going to be spending some time talking about what it's like being a queer trans woman in 2022. Be prepared for it to not to be real bright and shiny and happy. But I will apologize in advance for that. But hopefully I'll see you there. Otherwise, have a great week. I'll see you next week.